G'day, my name's Martin Jagers. I'm the lead developer, qualifier, supporter, maintainer of JADE Care Start, which is also known as card schema. And basically JADE Care Start is the card schema and forms, some DLLs, some documentation, and basically this session is taking a few pieces out of card schema which we think could be used by developers, sort of tips and tricks. Card schema has been out there for quite a while, but we haven't actually communicated some of the features that are in there, which could be used by probably everybody here. Anybody who uses Jade. JADE Care Start is free. It's on the website. You can download it. You don't need to get a license for it. And it's supported by Jade Software Corporation. Anything that's in the documentation of card schema, we stand by. And so you can open the contact and we will address any issues. Card schema and JADE Care Start provides a whole lot of ready-use features, one of them being a recognised, supported software backup strategy, which I'll talk about in more detail later. We've got exception handlers, which we think are pretty useful. There's a white paper on exception handling, and a lot of that is to do with the card schema exception handling, deadlock handling, lock exception handling, which I'll also reference later. One of the examples. Yeah. So the contents I'm going to be covering today, which are only a small facet of what's in card schema, is the context of method invocation, business transaction performance and gathering of statistics of the business transactions, supported database backup strategy, and the use of the card schema global exception handlers and why they're so useful. Context of a method invocation. Now I've got a real life example which I'll refer to a bit later as to how this has been useful, but it's quite useful. Well, I think it is, and I know other people have used it. You want to find out where at runtime a particular method has been invoked from. I mean, looking at it through the IDE, you can see this method was called from this many methods, but what's the stack at runtime that invoked that method? So by adding these simple variables, create a singleton of SC and stack dump, optionally a call stack string, and in the begin statement, after the begin statement somewhere, you create this singleton of transient, and you then execute dump call stack on the singleton. You will get returned into the call stack string, the call stack at that time of where that method was executed. You can then log that yourself, or if you use the arguments in the call stack, it will dump it into the CN log, which is the card schema provided log, which you could automatically. And then you can, of course, in the epi-log, you want to get rid of that singleton afterwards. Now, this looks like this here. So the dump call stack was put into that method. So that's why it's being shown here, and that was executed by the server execution method, which in turn was executed by the button dump call stack click, which was in turn done by the root schema. So that's only 3 levels deep, but I've seen examples of a couple of hundred methods deep. And one of the real life situations where we found this was one of our developers, Mitch Nicholson. She's now moved on, unfortunately. But she was sitting there trying to instrument the transactions to use the performance, which we're going to cover shortly. And she had an issue in there. She was trying to figure out something was going wrong. And she didn't exactly know where that method was being called from. We did that piece of code there, and straight away she sat there and saw the entire call stack, and she says, I didn't even know it was being called like that. So it was a very quick and easy way to find out why she was having the problem that she was having. Okay, the next thing is the business transaction performance. Card schema allows you, with a couple of method calls, to instrument your transactions. Now, a business transaction is not a database transaction. In fact, you may not even execute a begin or commit transaction. It's like something like a click event, or a web request, or a report cycle. And what you do there is you're assuming that card schema is one of your super schemas, and it assumes that the application is executed and initialized, preferably, the see and activate Karma control, because there's a couple of singletons that are required. That activate see and Karma control is not only required for JADE Care system managed service, but it is useful also in your everyday Jade system. You identify your desired business transaction, like the button click event, the button OK or something like that. And at the start of the business transaction, after the begin statement, you enter, oops, sorry about that. You put in that piece of code there, see and start transaction, and a tag which uniquely identifies your transaction. We often use method.qualifiedName, which gives you the class and the method name. Very easy to use. And at the end of in your epilogue, you put in CNN transaction. The output from that information, which I'll give you a slide about what it's going to be, what it's going to deliver to you, is put into a CN Translog CSV or into a CSV which is unique for each application or each instantiation of an application. So you get a CSV file with a lot of statistics about every transaction that you have instrumented by putting those CN start and end transaction. So this is what you get out. The top row is what you get out by default. So you get the date and time of the transaction, the workstation where it was executed from, the server on which the app server was running or the database, the IP address, the app name, the user. There's the method.qualifiedName, the elapsed time, the CPU, the database transaction ID because it's matched up with that, and the process ID, the instance. The rest of this good stuff is what happens when you have node sampling enabled, which is only a single any file option. So you can get the number of get objects, lock objects, unlocks, creates, updates, deletes, commits, number of server executions, how long you spent in the server execution, any locking, queue time. And this is in card schema and has been since 3.3. We're on 3.9 now. Yep.
Is it expensive?
It's what?
Is it expensive to...
With the node sampling on, it's measurable in Performance Lab. But we have some production users who have node sampling on. And we've got a lot of customers who are using this so we can get stats in the JADE Care Managed Service. But you can get this on any JADE application if you've got card schema on there at the super schema level. And that's free. All you've got to do is put those couple of messages in each method. And you don't have to do it in every method, on every transaction. You do it on the ones that you're really interested in, you know, which ones have got bad performance, why have they got bad performance, and how many get objects and lock objects you're doing. You know, how many times you go into the server. And you've also got the stuff here for thin clients. How many messages are going from the thin client to the app server? How many bytes are going there? And what's the network time? That's node sampling. And that's available right now, free.
Can node sampling be initiated on the fly or is it
It's, you can turn it on in any file, but you have to cycle the application or applications that you want to do it on. There is one caveat you also have to cycle the node because every node, every Jade exe that you run or Jade app that you want to do this on will consume a process license because with node sampling it executes an application called KC node control. But that's only if node sampling is turned on. So that's that information. These are the file settings. So you're going to be getting a copy of this presentation. So you don't even have to go and look at the card schema class library documentation. The file settings are right here for you. So you want to have this setting, calm control equal false. If that's true, it expects to be a JADE Care managed environment that's going to try and open a connection to an agent running on your server. You may want to have that true, because if you have that true, then what you'll get is you'll get all the transactions in the one file for every application. So that means it's all aggregated in one file rather than having lots and lots of application files. You want to set client transstats equal true and system transstats equal true. Historical reasons for that, but that's how it is. That setting only has to be set to a value if you've got KCC Manager running, because that tells you how often KCC Manager is going to harvest the transaction from the various applications that are running. Defeat node sampling equal false will enable node sampling. The second line of that, what I was showing you before. And log logical transactions equal true. if you've got KCC Manager running and you're aggregating into here, you probably want to set that to false, otherwise you're going to get one CSV file for every application instantiation. Right, but some of those transactions, an OK click event or a web request, may suspend for a while. It may do a process sleep, or it may do an app message box, or an app do window events. Now, you don't want to collect the elapsed time over that, because a user may look at this pop-up app message box and may sit there for 5 minutes. Well, that's going to cause chaos to your stats for all those individual transactions. So it's going to go crazy. So what you want to do is bound that code with a see and suspend transaction before where you suspend, and a see and resume transaction that basically turns the elapsed timer off for that period of time. So you're getting a true picture of what resources your click event took, or whatever the business transaction is. And if you're looking at node sampling, most transactions will go through and will have a certain profile. But if you have an error transaction, that probably won't look anything like the 80% of transactions that go through normally. So you may want to flag that as being an error state or something different. So all you've got to do is, before you execute the CNN transaction, if you know you're in error state, just execute that method, and there's a flag in the file which says this is an error transaction. So you can differentiate them. And if you really want to sit there and you're in such a bad state that you don't want the transaction at all to be recorded, because it makes it look so bad, you can use CNN discard transaction. So you can cook the books, basically. So that's that section done. Supported database backup strategy. Now, backups, God, they're boring, but they are so critical. And we've had a number of situations where the Jade plant has been called in at the last minute because a backup strategy for a site may have not been kept up to date. The code may have been developed back in 3.3 or Jade 5. Jade's moved on since then. We've got SDS, we've got partitioning, we've got unstructured data resources, all this sort of stuff. Journaling has changed. You've got a bought journal, you've got your last journal, all that sort of thing. Now, we keep this backup strategy up to date. We recommend that you use it. We support it. We use the guts of the database engine in our everyday backup strategy for the JADE Care Managed Service, but we've extended it to be able to be used by anybody. And it can be used out of the box. It's called KC Database Backup Multi. It's in card schema. It's documented heavily in the card schema class library document, which goes out with every release package. We've got an online and an offline, both online and offline backup are supported. It's multi-threaded. And by it's only for the database backup that it's multi-threaded, but it will go down to not only the map file, but down to the partition level if you're using partitions. By default, it will back up the database and a binaries directory. And if you wish other directories to be used, to be backed up, you just define it in the ini file, and we'll back up that directory as well, or those other directories as well. Like I said, it's documented in the card schema class library document. It can be used out of the box without anything, just by using a batch script, PowerShell, CMD file, or BAT, and you can just initiate a command line argument, schema equals card schema, app equals KC database backup multi. That's all you need. And then you can either provide your command line arguments about what the backup directory is, how many workers you want, whether you want compressed or quiesced. Quiesced is like a poor man's offline. It puts it into a consistent state. And then you've got your directories that you can include. If you wish to, majority of the command lines, apart from everything down to disable backup notifications, you either have them on the command line or you have them in any file. So it's all or nothing. You can also initiate this application through your own logic, and you can subscribe to notifications so that you can, at minimum, identify whether it's succeeded or failed. But you can also get progress events if you wish to. So you can, and we have an example schema which is provided with the card schema, which you can plagiarise, you can use it to your heart's content, and it's called backup test DB. And it will exercise the backup strategy. And you can use that, insert it to your own schema if you wish to, or at your own level and use. But it shows you how to do the notifications and the initiation and get the progress events and successful or failed completion events. So that's the backup strategy. Global exception handlers. Card schema provides 3 exception handlers. We've got the CN global exception handler. That typically sits before the JADE default exception handler. Everybody knows what the JADE exception handler looks like. You get the dialogue and the exception and a bit of information about it. With the global exception handler that we provide, you also get a stack dump by default, and we'll cover that in a bit more. We also have a lock exception handler and a deadlock exception handler. And if you execute the CN activate calm and control, this one here, it will arm those as global exception handlers on the client and on the server. So that if you get an exception on the client or the server, you will get a stack dump and you will get a notification or go to the appropriate exception handler. You can change the any file settings to leave JADE as the global exception handler, or you can have card schema, and that's the default if you don't have this specified, or you can have both, so that it'll arm each of those, but then when it gets to this one, it will pass back to the JADE one, so you get the JADE dialog up on the screen, on the desktop if you wish. The card schema global exception handlers are armed when you've got the any file set to that, and you've activated calm control. Unhandled exceptions will generate a card schema stack dump. And the card schema stack dump is quite detailed. I don't know if everybody has used it. Okay. You can invoke the stack dump routine from your own exception handlers if you wish. It's on the CN stack dump singleton, and you just need to say stack dump and pass the exception object. So you can actually get a stack. You can invoke a stack dump from your own exception handlers if you wish. And you can also, in the ini file, you can also say a mini dump, because depending on how big the stack is and how many objects you've got, it can be quite a big file and can impinge on your performance. If you want to turn it around fast, then you want to say log stack mini dump equal true, and you'll only get the stack. You won't get the complete diagnostic with every class, every property shown. So you'll get, given that you're going to get the full dump, you'll get the details about the application, the server, the JADE version, the card schema version, your own application version, what server it executed on, the time of day, which application. You'll get the call stack history, you'll get the exception stack history, and you'll get a method by method breakdown, and it will show all the parameters and the contents for every method, and the local variables, classes and properties for every method, and the values of those properties. Now, probably 80 to 90% of any stack dump I've ever looked at normally gives me the resolution. Sometimes you've got to go further and look at the context, but oftentimes that will give me enough information to go and resolve a problem. There is a censored option if you've got sensitive data. Some of our AML clients, financial crime, they don't want the information being shown in a stack dump which goes off site. So you have a censored option in the ini file, and any values that are in there will be overwritten with just the OID content, OID name and censored. But you will still see all the properties listed and the stack. So there is some sensitivity on stack dumps. Lock exception. So our deadlock exception handler will automatically retry any lock exception it gets. And the default and the interval by default, if you haven't specified it, is the server timeout, which defaults typically to 10 seconds. So if you're trying to do a lock, like an implicit lock or an exclusive or an explicit lock, like exclusive or shared or reserve, it will wait for up to 10 seconds to try to resolve that lock. And if it goes over 10 seconds, it will cause a 1027. But our lock exception handler jumps in and interferes with that. It grabs it. And it will sit there and retry that lock to a default of 60 seconds. And you can change that either through the ini file or through the singleton CNC and TRL. So you can set up how long you're going to wait, and you can also set up how many times you're going to retry, or how long you're going to retry for. So on a successful retry, it will allow the logic to continue the execution, because we've now got the lock, so we can carry on to the next statement in the method we were in. But the really nice thing is, you will get the information in the lock exception CSV. This goes hand in hand with the performance stuff we were talking about earlier. You sit there and you're looking through your performance and you see all these transactions are taking, two seconds roughly. But this one here took 35 seconds. What the hell's going on here? Well, maybe you were contending for a lock. It might have been, so some good information there. If you've got a lot of information in the CSV file, maybe you need to go and check about your locking strategy, and maybe you've got some issues there. In that lock exception CSV, the information you've got in there is the application that caused the lock, that's incurring the lock, the date and time when it happened, when they first started, the JADE process and instance, the lock target, the object that you're trying to lock, the collection or the actual object itself, what type of lock you're trying to do. Are you trying to do a reserve lock or an exclusive or a shared lock? The method and the source and the position where the lock exception occurred. How many times you retried the lock before it got achieved. The elapsed time of how long we're contending for. And details of the other party to the lock. So, but if the lock fails, if that lock exception fails, then it will jump back to the CN global exception handler, and you'll get a 1027 stack done. So if you don't have your own lock exception handler, this may be a good one to use. And I've found there are quite a number of systems where we are actually retrying because their locking strategy may not be 100% or they have a basic issue. We have a deadlock exception handler. Now, by default, we don't retry deadlocks. You basically have to know a little bit about what you're doing here. Very simple to arm it though. You just need to execute the singleton, set the deadlock retry limit, and how many retries you want to allow. In some cases, it may be faster for you to say, especially if it's a GUI, throw up something on desktop saying, I had a deadlock, you want to try again, please? That may be faster than us trying to retry the deadlock. But we are using it, especially on background apps where you don't have a user, where you can't throw up a GUI, pop up and say, can I do a retry? And sometimes it's a critical application, so you do want to retry. But basically what will happen is the deadlock will occur, we will cut back, the stack will be cut back, but we search through the stack and we find out the methods where we can retry from, and we will save off all the arguments, let the stack get cut back, basically so you go back to idle, and then we will retry that method again with the arguments that you passed to us, to Jade. Only issue at the moment is that the retry can only be performed on methods that are using up to 12 arguments. So if you're using more than 12 arguments, sorry. And we are looking to possibly lift that. When I was creating this presentation, somebody for the Jade plants stepped up and said, hey, we can do it this way. So that's really useful. The lock exception handler and the deadlock exception handler does provide a user hook. We provide the message saying you've got a lock issue or a deadlock issue, and we state what that is, and so you can write your own method to report that and turn it into your own system if you wish to. And like I said, JADE Care Start is free. It can be downloaded from the website, and that's the link on the website that you can get it from. So when you get the presentation, please go in there and copy it down and have a look at it. There's a lot of other stuff in the class library document. A bit dry, but can be useful. But feel free to email me or ask questions. So open to the floor now for questions, please. Stunned silence, awesome.
Questions, comments?
Lovely.
Okay, you're the only one. So we do have a couple of minutes to swap the mic here. So if you would come up, John will ask his questions. If you think of a question for Martin in that time, raise your hand.
Okay, so it's not so much a question for Martin as just a comment. When we were doing the previews of the presentations and the rehearsals, I was actually quite surprised at how much capability there was available in the card schema and JADE Care when you're not running on the managed service. So a lot of this stuff I'd always imagined was only available if you're on the managed service, but for those of you that aren't, you can still get a lot of benefit from installing card schema and making use of some of these things. So I think it's definitely worth looking at. Yeah, I was quite impressed. Should have known it already, but impressed.